So I went to my spare parts bin and look what I found. Some rear shocks for the B15 Sentra. They're probably off a 1.8 liter, but I checked the part numbers on Rock Auto and some companies use the same part number, so whatever. It'll at least get me out of a bind. I figured out the problem we had with the rear suspension that was making noise. The noise I was hearing was this washer here. Under load, the shock actually pushes. Obviously, there's nothing to hold it here from going up. But under here, I'm supposed to have this bump stop, and then this dinky little washer here forced its way through the rubber. And there's nothing stopping the shock here from pushing up through. Now, this is the bad example, and I don't know why this was even done. Probably the person who changed the suspension last on the car didn't put the hat back on. So this is what it's supposed to look like over here. See this big metal hat here? There, that's supposed to do the job in stopping the shock from going up inside. That'll do a far better job instead of ripping through the rubber bushing. Well, it compresses it evenly across a greater area. That is the reason why the rear suspension was making all that noise and had like an inch and a half of slack. This under load, this washer would come up like to here. The whole thing would move out. Now that being said, this rear suspension would bounce anyway. So the shocks themselves, they're done. I just changed the rear suspension on the Rallycross car. I want to start characterizing what we're using instead of just blindly throwing parts on cars and not really knowing really the difference between one thing or another. So I just want data. I'm a guy who likes data. You can't have too much data. You just filter it. So this old shock is done, right? Not knowing at all what the damping force of these are stock. This is a replacement shock, by the way. It is still KYB, like found on Nissans, except it's a KYB XLG. So what I'm going to do is I have a scale here, and I know the scale is remotely okay. This scale is set to 0. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to set the shock on there. And I'm going to press down just so that I get movement in the shock. And I'm going to see how much it takes there. This is not going to be very reliable, actually. It takes 18 pounds. See, the idea is when I get another shock, I'll be able to verify how much pounds it takes to push it in. Like a new shock, let's say. And then I'll be able to know, take the shock off the car halfway through the season, measure it, and verify if it's going out or not, so I can plan in advance. I'd like to be able to change the shock before the shock goes, actually. So that was that. Another thing I could do, I guess, would be to push the shock all the way in and then time it and see how long it takes to come out. I've got it pushed up against the counter here. You ready? Done. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with the data, but I'll be able to compare it to a new shock and just collect the information. So the question I have for everybody involved in racing, especially rally or whatever, with maybe softer shocks, you probably can't do this with like super stiff shocks. You probably need a machine for it. But is this pertinent? Will this help me out to be able to diagnose eventual suspension fatigue? So I've just released this shock about 6 times, which is a minimum, as a lot of you know. And we get we get very, very close to 9 seconds a pop. I also know that there's something called a shock dyno. I think some people use those, which I believe pushes the shock in and out at different speeds and different forces to be able to characterize a shock. And that's what we're presenting on Shifted Racing, is non-expert advice, but at least we're trying to get something done, and we're trying to race as best we can. So here's the right shock. It's, look at that. It's got looseness in it, like so much. Just with my pinky finger I can push it in. It does hit some resistance further down, but the shock is completely blown. To think we ran the last like 3 stages, well, the last maybe even the rallycross before it, on these shocks is pathetic. Like that. Oh, it goes in. Oh, it doesn't come out. So, there, that gives you an idea. We won't even be able to measure how long it takes to come out, because it never will come out. So this shock is definitely completely shot. Now, I also had the bright idea of maybe seeing if I can use my Mastercraft 10-ton press to measure the spring rate of the old coil spring. So after a couple more scotches, I came up with this idea. Got my scale on there, shimmed up, propped up on metal. My flat end of the spring is on there, on the scale. I chopped this down a little bit more. I'm going to slide that in there. There we are. I'm going to find a decent shim to put on top of that. How about that? Nice little hat. And then I'm going to compress that 1 inch and measure the load. So I picked up the slack. I measured from, I brought it up to 20 pounds on the scale, roughly. And then I took this measurement to here, and it was a little over 2.5 inches. Then I readjusted the scale to 20 pounds. It was just off a little bit, so I could start with a fresh mark. And then I went from 2.5 inches here to 1.5 inches. So we have 1 inch of spring rate. I know I'm not like in the half of the travel. Like if these are somewhat progressive springs, it's going to change something. But on the scale here, what do we read? We read 112. 20 to 112. So I did it again, starting from 0, which means I just touched it, set it to 0, and started almost off at 0 pounds, and then ran it up to 1 inch compression. And I had 85 for the rear coils. That seems soft to me. You know, it's not flat. The top is not bad, but it's on an angle. So the idea is I'm gonna probably have to modify the old strut, put it on the press, and really make sure I'm pushing really through the mid plane of the coil spring. So that way we'll be able to get a more adequate reading on the scale, because the scale is pretty good. Like I weigh 160 pounds, and that's what it reads. And I tried putting 1 foot here, it reads 160 pounds. So I thought it might be a flex thing. Put 2 feet, it's 160 pounds. So anyway, I was looking up coil spring testers on the web, and they range from $300 US to $1,200. So I could maybe buy a $300 one, and who's dumb enough to go through all this effort? Like just me. People usually they throw all their crap away and then they buy new stuff. But this is low budget shifted racing stuff. So my new plan is I cut the shock casing off to retain the lower coil spring seat. And I had this laying around. This is the casing. I'm going to weld that onto there. Then the shock will come and sit here, nice and upright once it's welded. And then I will use my top hat, I guess if I can call it that. And then I'll compress that onto the scale. Let's see if that works. So I just tested this and it seems to work pretty well. I moved it down 1 inch to preload basically, and then I set this was up to close to 40 kilos, and I just adjusted it so it was smack on 40 kilos, and then I went down another inch, measured, and it indicated 125 kilos. So 40 to 125 kilos. It looks like this coil spring, rear coil spring for a Sentra Spec-V is 190 pounds per inch. which is actually the spec of the non-Spec-V Sentras. So maybe the previous owner swapped out a set of struts from a non-Spec-V car. That I'd have to figure out. But 190 pounds per inch on the stock versus 250 on the Spec-V. So in the meantime, Mathieu Royer, who built himself a stage rally Sentra, he sent me a photo of his setup. He had a set of springs laying around, he tested them. On the top graph, he compressed only the spring with no rubber top mount. And he was getting in the range of 250 spring rate, which is normal, between 1.5 and 2.5 inches of compression. What I was doing to get 190 was what you see on the bottom chart, which is the spring with the top mount. He was getting 228, 230 pounds per inch. My testing compared to his testing, if I compare setup to setup, I'm roughly 30 to 35 pounds per inch lower than he is. So either these are stock Spec-V springs that are just tired out of their minds, or I've got 1.8 Sentra springs on. That's something I'll look into. If I want to stiffen up my springs, I can find solutions now that I know what my figures actually are. And this is the reasoning behind all this testing that I've just done. I know what my springs are at. I know what my springs should be at. And I also have another reference point from Mathieu Royer. So let's move on to something else. The springs on the car work for now, I guess. We're still months away from the next gravel rallycross, so we can crack on with something else, but at least we have this data lying around on the computer somewhere. So catch you next time.